Photographic Ethics, Module 4, Ethics, Images, and Power Dynamics. I'm your host, Aubrey P. Graham, and should you need to contact me for anything, my email is aubreygraham@gmail.com. Please note that all images used in these 6 modules, unless otherwise indicated, were produced by myself. I hold the copyright to the images. Photographs cannot be reproduced, copied, shared, or otherwise repurposed without my consent. For questions on how to use any of the images shown here in other contexts, please email me at aubreygraham@gmail.com. Power dynamics. Power dynamics are the ability to influence or control others through an inequality of power, particularly around issues of race, gender, class, etc. This includes ability and relationship to the camera in this case. So the camera acts as a fulcrum, a central point across which power dynamics are leveraged. The photographer stands in a position of power in relation to the subjects and face ethical choices in creating their images. The national and international FETP staff who help carry out the epidemiological work and create the images also hold positions of power. Power can also be reflected within composition. So power and individual agency exist on both sides of the camera. The photographer has the ability and the power to determine what the photograph will look like and how they shape the representational meaning and the narrative that comes through. And the subject on the other side of the camera has the ability to perform for the camera, to acknowledge the photographer, to avoid the photograph, to shape their body, their context, and their engagement with the camera in the ways that they wish. So agency existing on both sides of the camera, however, does not mean that the power dynamics are equal. But within composition, one can work to show dignity, ethics, and do what one can to equalize and be equitable in the representation. So power dynamics can be represented through, for positive and negative, through the angle of the photograph, through active versus passive subjects, through the position relative of one subject relative to other subjects, and to a position relative to the camera or the viewer. The visualization of power dynamics have the ability to show empowerment, agency, and equitable interaction, but also to disempower subjects through forms of objectification. We're going to talk about the various ways which, as a photographer, after one has gained consent, after one has grappled with the existing power dynamics in gaining consent, that one can work to use composition and the creation of the photograph as a way to not objectify, but to empower and show the dignity and agency of the photographic subject. One of the ways is through the angle of the photograph. Photographing from below can, in certain situations, and many situations in fact, provide power back to the subject. It's from the viewer's point of view. When you look at this image as a viewer, you are positioned lower than the subjects in it. You are in fact looking up to them. They are explaining something to you. You are not giving something to them. And so just from positioning the camera lower than the subjects and shooting up, this photograph provides and shows the power, the strength, and the dignity of the individuals in it. Photographing from similar heights creates an equitable engagement where the subject and the photographer are on the same plane. And where one runs into trouble sometimes, while shooting from above can create really wonderful photographs, it also holds a position of power and re-emphasizes the power that the photographer holds, and then the power that the viewer is then slotted into in literally looking down on the subjects in the photograph. The recommendation is to be aware first that when one is photographing from above, that it has the power to objectify the subjects within the image and to disempower them. Further, the encouragement is to experiment with different heights when taking photograph. Kneel, crouch, put the camera low to the ground, shoot from over one's head. Try different things beyond just standing or shooting out of a car door in terms of getting different angles, as it will create a different narrative. Power dynamics also come into play with active or passive subjects. So active subjects show their own agency and their ability to engage in and shape the world around them. Action is preferable to passivity in most photographic cases. Passive subjects become objects. This object likeness makes objectification simple from the viewer's point of view. Often such images are not necessarily representative of the overarching situation in which these individuals exist. So you can see active subjects here wheeling themselves. This is a para basketball team wheeling themselves across a basketball court. And you can see passive subjects here sitting, looking a bit sad, staring at the camera. Now, of course, these women, were I to wait around to take this photograph a little bit later, were cooking food, cleaning things, heading to the market, taking care of their children. This image of passivity is representative of one moment of life, but it's certainly not representative of all of them. It's also a common form of photography, is to take the photograph when people are still, as that's when they're expecting the photo to be taken. To get those more active photographs, as I mentioned in previous webinars, sometimes one must just take the time to stay there to gain the trust of the subjects, to have gained all of the consent necessary to be able to take the photographs when people are active, moving, and doing their normal day-to-day lives. So subjects' ability, race, class, gender, sexuality, etc., all of these things factor into the power dynamics that happen across the lens. So ethics informs photographs that show equity of choice and action between both epidemiological teams and FETP trainees and the populations they treat and are learning with. Race, class, nationality, ability, and gender of those in the image and the photographer can impact the image and the power within it, especially when teams are interacting with a population of individuals who may be different in one way or another from themselves. And different in one way or another from themselves means things like socioeconomic class, education, gender, race, nationality, ethnicity, levels of urbanness, of having traveled, of experience, and even simply just working for the agency. All of these things come into factor into the power dynamics that are then shaped in the image. Within the image itself, when we think about how the narrative we're creating and the power dynamics that are happening between subjects as well, this is another important place where power dynamics are critical. As you can see here, there's a physiotherapist, a mother, and a child. Were the photograph to be different with a physiotherapist standing higher, the empowerment and the agency of the mother and child would be lessened in terms of what the narrative is. Here, the woman on the right is simply helping the power that is still happening. Another way to think about this is through this image, in which case it's very clear with the narrative you have two subjects of a different race, gender, and age from the man on the right, and yet he's standing higher in the hill, and based on the dynamics of the height and position of the subjects to each other within the image, it's quite clear from the narrative that he is explaining something to them. He is the one empowered. He has dignity, power, the ability to explain. He is not being explained to. Now, were that shifted, we would have a different image. But thinking about the relationship between subjects in terms of their positionality within the image itself is important in crafting that narrative and ensuring that power dynamics that exist in that situation are being managed in certain ways to still create the narrative that you want the photograph to tell. In this case, the woman on the left is working for a particular NGO and is very clearly listening to the women and the man who's also sitting there on the step. And that act of listening and who is talking and their position tells us about dignity, tells us about agency and the power between these populations, even though one is working for an agency and one is receiving aid from that agency. Right, so you can see that the various lineups of how and compositional elements of how subjects interact with each other in these images shape the narrative that can tell us about the power dynamics. Importantly, power dynamics can sometimes determine the fact that an image should be anonymous or that someone, the subject in the image, would like an image to be anonymous. So there are many times when photographing, that taking an anonymous photograph may be the most ethical response to a situation. Certain reasons that an anonymous photo might be the best bet are certain medical health conditions and the related potential of stigma, sensitive topics such as sexual violence or stigmatized diseases, possible discrimination in home, work, community, or program should someone see that photograph or know that it was taken, Political reasons, whether they're national, community-based, family-based, then also the desire of the subject simply to not have an identifiable information in the photograph for any reason, or simply because the subject does not want to be identified, right? So we have anonymous photographs that can be taken in many different ways and yet can still be compelling, interesting photographs that deal with these power dynamics. As I mentioned in a previous webinar, taking a silhouette where the light is behind the subject, and so the subject is in between the photographer and the light, will create a silhouette which reduces identifiable features. It does not always eradicate them completely, but it does reduce them by turning the subject into full shadow. Further, so long as you have consent from the subject, photographing from behind can also help to make the photograph more anonymous. Another way to do this that is still compelling is to zoom in or get closer and move in so the camera frame only sees certain features, not the recognizable ones, therefore focusing on hands, on feet, on artifacts, on relevant body parts and details. As you can see on the right, the feet, we can tell by just the fact that the toes are painted on the individual on the left that is probably a woman, whereas the toes on the right and the hand seem to be that of a man. The image is still compelling, still tells a story, but we don't know who those people are. Similarly with the hands weaving the basket here, the hands and the weaving tell us about an activity, they tell us about an individual without giving us identifiable features. People's things, homes, desks, kitchens, drawings, cooking areas, fields, offices, routes through town, etc., provide ample photographic information that also tell us about their lives without them being a visual part of it. This image is from a prison, and while none of the prisoners, which would be sensitive for political reasons, as well as personal reasons, none of the prisoners are featured. Their designs that they've etched into the wall are extraordinarily telling and create a photograph that is strong despite not having a human element in it. Further, landscapes that tell us about a space, even though there are no people present in this photograph 1 year after the earthquake in Haiti, we can still see both evidence of continued life and destruction, creating a narrative that is powerful, yet anonymous. Also, asking individuals what images they would like taken. If they don't want their face shown, they may have a set of artifacts that are important to them that they want featured. In this case, this man wanted the photograph of his daughter shown, but did not necessarily, for this particular image, want to be in it. And then thinking about the landscapes of the space in which people exist. Again, this is a photograph from behind of an individual, but it also shows the area in the DRC and gives context. So in summary, power dynamics exist both across the camera between subject and photographer, but they also exist within the image itself. So ethics requests that the photographer work to maintain a subject's dignity and agency while taking a responsible and agentive photograph, one that is not showing passivity that is not representative. Knowledge of the power dynamics implicit in photography and how to avoid certain forms of representation, i.e. shooting from above and objectifying, can increase the quality of photography and enhance the ethics behind it, while also creating more dynamic narratives within the image. What's up next is ethical image editing, and that's going to be our 5th module called, aptly, ethical editing.